Welcome, everyone, to this study of an absolutely epic clash from the year 1177, the Battle of Montgisard. Okay, let's dive right into this, because we're traveling back to the late 12th century, to a moment when the fate of the entire Holy Land was hanging by a thread so incredibly thin it was practically invisible. I really want you to imagine the blistering heat of the Levant, that pervasive, choking dust, and the suffocating tension that had completely gripped the region. The Crusader states at this time were in a state of absolute, undeniable desperation. They were completely surrounded by enemies on all sides, and they were heavily fractured from within. Now, the story we are looking at today, it is a historical thriller of the absolute highest order. It's a study of a single moment in time featuring unbelievable odds, devastating human illness, and an outcome that absolutely defied every single known rule of medieval warfare, literally altering the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East in a single afternoon.
So let's look at the numbers. 26,000 against 500. On November 25th, 1177, a tiny, practically microscopic fraction of Christian knights faced down Islam's absolute finest warriors. We are talking about a staggering 52-1 disadvantage in heavy cavalry. Now, I want you to consider what that actually looks and sounds like on a physical battlefield. Picture the thundering hooves of tens of thousands of massive war horses. They're kicking up this blinding storm of sand, creating a literal wall of noise and steel that stretches just as far as the eye can see. And against that sheer, overwhelming mass is a tiny, isolated cluster of just 500 men. Militarily speaking, guys, this shouldn't just be a defeat. It should be a total, unmitigated annihilation. Every single military manual, every precedent of warfare ever written dictated that in an open field battle, an army of that massive size is going to effortlessly swallow a small one whole. Yet somehow, by sunset on that very same day, the most powerful Muslim army in the world lay completely and utterly shattered.
Which brings us to the central question that's going to frame our entire study today. How on earth did a dying 16-year-old boy outsmart history's greatest sultan? This isn't just a dry military history study. It is a real-life David versus Goliath narrative, and it's driven entirely by raw faith, clashing steel, and just sheer, undeniable tactical brilliance. We have a teenager whose body was literally decaying from a horrific disease. In the 12th century, you have to understand, leprosy wasn't just treated as a medical condition. It was widely viewed by the public as a divine curse. It meant total physical decay, and usually it meant absolute social ostracization. People afflicted with it were essentially treated as the living dead. Yet this boy, suffering unimaginable, constant agony, was squaring off against a legendary, undefeated leader who represented the absolute pinnacle of health, prestige, and worldly power. The sheer willpower required for this young king to even show up to the battlefield that day is, quite frankly, almost beyond human comprehension.
Section 1. The Doomed Kingdom and the Two Monarchs.
So the year 1177 definitely marked the darkest hour for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For decades, Christian knights had been desperately clinging to this precarious foothold in the Levant, but right now, the great Crusader fortresses were falling one by one. The kingdom itself was horribly fractured by intense internal rivalries. The smart money at the time? Well, everyone was saying Jerusalem had months, maybe just a few weeks, before an inevitable total collapse. In fact, the city's nobles were already quietly negotiating treaties behind closed doors and packing up their ships for exile. They were seriously bracing for the end of the world as they knew it. And right at the center of this doomed realm was King Baldwin IV. He was just 16 years old, and he suffered from advanced leprosy. His hands had to be wrapped in thick silk bandages because his flesh was heavily necrotic, meaning he literally couldn't even feel the hilt of his own sword. And to spare his subjects the horrifying sight of his deteriorating face, he hid his ravaged features behind his silver mask. Now, on the completely opposite side stood Saladin. At 40 years old, he was known as the Sword of Islam. He was an undefeated sultan who had masterfully united the vast resources of both Egypt and Syria, forging what was undoubtedly the most powerful Muslim state since the early caliphates. He possessed immense physical health, staggering wealth, and an unparalleled military genius. As you can see, the power dynamic here was completely and utterly asymmetrical.
Section 2. The March of 26,000. In the autumn of 1177, Saladin decided it was finally time to end the Crusader states once and for all. He massed the absolute largest army of his entire career and marched rapidly across the Egyptian frontier.
He was moving with supreme confidence, mostly because he knew that the bulk of the Crusader forces were actually far away campaigning in the north, so he just bypassed mighty fortresses with ease, utterly convinced that the tiny remaining forces left in Jerusalem posed absolutely zero threat to his massive invasion. Look at this breakdown. Saladin brought an unstoppable war machine consisting of 8,000 elite Mamluks. Now these were terrifying slave soldiers, rigorously trained from early childhood in a highly disciplined military system. Each individual Mamluk was widely considered to be worth 3 ordinary cavalrymen in combat, and backing them up, another 18,000 light cavalry and foot soldiers. Now look at Baldwin. He could barely script together a ragtag coalition. He had about 500 knights in total, which included just 80 Knights Templar, and they were supported by roughly 3,000 hastily gathered local infantry levies, which were mostly just undertrained commoners holding basic weaponry. So you have 26,000 heavily armed elite veterans against roughly 3,500 desperate defenders. The math here is just brutal. It is literally the arithmetic of annihilation.
Yet, despite all this, Baldwin refused to just sit and hide behind the walls of Jerusalem. When his advisors were practically begging him to stay put, the teenage leper king instead ordered an agonizing forced march, 45 miles in 36 hours. I want you to imagine for a second the sheer agonizing physical reality of a forced march through an arid desert. Now imagine doing that while wearing heavy chainmail armor, baking under a relentless Middle Eastern sun. And finally, imagine doing all of that while suffering from a necrotic disease, where every single step causes your deadened skin to chafe and literally tear against the steel. It was pure, unadulterated torture. When the pain actually became too great and Baldwin lost consciousness from the sheer agony of it, the Templars stepped in and took turns physically carrying his litter upon their own shoulders. He pushed his men and he pushed himself way beyond the utmost limits of human endurance. Why? Because strategically he knew he absolutely had to intercept Saladin out in the field before Jerusalem was completely surrounded and choked into submission.
Section 3. The Tactical Trap.
So here's where things get really interesting. Saladin, the seasoned, brilliant military genius, made one fatal assumption. He fully believed that the young, dying king would just cower behind Jerusalem's walls. And this extreme overconfidence caused the Sultan to let his guard down in a way he honestly never had before. Geography and military logic favored Saladin so heavily, he just saw no reason to maintain strict march discipline. First, he bypassed the vital fortress of Ascalon, which left enemy forces completely intact at his rear. Then, he allowed his massive army to just scatter across the countryside to pillage and forage, which effectively diluted his overwhelming numerical superiority. But even worse than that, the geography of Montgisard itself presented a massive hidden danger. The ground there was completely muddy and soggy from heavy autumn rains. So, as Saladin is marching toward Jerusalem, his sprawling, massive army of 26,000 men becomes severely bottlenecked while trying to cross a swollen stream and a series of deep, natural ravines. You have to realize, an army of that massive size actually becomes highly vulnerable when you funnel it into tight, muddy corridors. And the absolute most critical factor in this impending disaster? The Sultan was completely unaware that Baldwin had marched out of Jerusalem and was rapidly closing the distance.
The pacing of this specific day is just a masterclass in escalating tension. At 6 a.m. on November 25th, Baldwin's utterly exhausted scouts finally spot the massive Muslim force, and they're just spread out chaotically over miles of terrain. So for hours, the Crusaders silently stalk their prey. Then, at 11 a.m., Saladin gets his very first panicked reports of fast-moving dust clouds approaching his vulnerable columns. But he actually dismisses them in utter disbelief, utterly convinced that no Crusader army could possibly be out there. By 12 p.m., though, the mounting panic in the Sultan's camp boils over into horrific realization. The dust clouds resolve, and the blood-red crosses of the Templar banners appear menacingly on the ridgeline right above the bottlenecked army. Saladin is frantically and desperately trying to form his scattered, disorganized ranks in the deep mud. And then, at exactly 2 p.m., rather than taking a defensive posture and waiting for the enemy to make a move, King Baldwin raises his bandaged hand. The signal is given, and the Crusaders drop their heavy ashwood lances right into position.
Section 4. The Hammer of God.
The sheer, absolute shock among Saladin's elite Mamluks in this precise moment really cannot be overstated. These were battle-hardened veterans, guys who had faced down the greatest, most massive armies in the world without ever flinching once. And now, they were just freezing in place, completely unable to process the sheer lunacy of what they were witnessing. Think about it. 500 exhausted men charging headlong into an army of tens of thousands wasn't considered a standard warfare tactic. To them, it literally looked like mass suicide. And the sound alone would have been absolutely terrifying.
500 ironclad Crusader horsemen, moving like an unstoppable avalanche, tearing across 300 yards of earth in under a minute, with the thunder of those hooves vibrating violently through the muddy ground. Watching from his command position, Saladin frantically screamed for his lines to form, but time had just completely run out. Muslim chroniclers faithfully recorded this chaotic moment, and they noted that the Sultan literally dropped his golden mace in utter, complete disbelief, muttering just a single word: madness.
And then, at just 100 yards out, something medically and physically impossible happened. Baldwin, who literally had to be strapped tightly to his saddle because his rotting legs could no longer grip the horse, and who was bleeding heavily from reopened wounds caused by that grueling march, he actually raised his sword. His diseased, nerve-deadened hands shouldn't have been able to even hold the heavy weapon, let alone swing it in the air. Yet every single historical source from the era, and we're talking both Christian and Muslim sources, which gives this moment immense historical weight, they all corroborate this incredible feat. The 16-year-old leper king, with tears of blood reportedly seeping from beneath his silver mask from the sheer agonizing physical exertion, was leading the heavy cavalry wedge directly from the very front of the line.
Section 5. Annihilation and Escape.
The kinetic impact of that charge was like a mountain collapsing. The 80 Knights Templar, who were forming the indestructible spear point of the wedge, smashed into the half-formed Ayyubid center at an absolute full gallop. In just the very first seconds, hundreds of elite Mamluks simply ceased to exist under the crushing weight of the war horses and the shattering of those heavy ashwood lances. But the real shock here was that the Crusaders didn't wheel away to regroup like a standard cavalry charge would normally dictate. No, they just kept going. They drove deeper and deeper into the Muslim ranks, absolutely refusing to retreat, with Baldwin's secular knights hitting right behind the Templars in a devastating second wave. The tactical situation rapidly devolved into a bloody slaughterhouse. The Muslim center didn't just retreat, it completely buckled and cracked under the immense pressure of a fanatical, unstoppable charge. And then Baldwin played a brilliant masterstroke. His 3,000 infantry, who had been stealthily hidden in the dead ground, suddenly appeared out of nowhere and violently flanked the panicked Ayyubid wings. Terrified shouts that they were completely surrounded spread like wildfire through the Muslim ranks. As Saladin's forces scrambled to flee, the geography that Baldwin had so smartly weaponized worked perfectly. Those muddy natural ravines turned into deadly, inescapable bottlenecks, literally trapping the fleeing soldiers in the muck. Finally, the unthinkable happened. Saladin's elite Mamluk bodyguards, men who had literally sworn blood oaths to die defending the Sultan, broke their formation and ran for their lives.
Facing the complete disintegration of his supposedly invincible army, Saladin was forced to make a desperate, split-second decision that would forever haunt his legendary reputation. You see, the muddy, congested terrain made his heavy warhorse far too slow to maneuver out of the active slaughter. So, to save his own life, the great, undefeated Sultan of Egypt and Syria abandoned his royal mount and scrambled onto a racing camel just to escape into the desert. Now, really consider the psychological fallout of this moment. What happens to the morale of an invincible army when their supreme god-king leader abandons his noble steed for a pack animal just to survive? It was an image of total humiliation. The psychological devastation of seeing their great leader flee shattered whatever tiny fragments of Muslim resistance were actually left on that muddy field.
The aftermath is just mind-blowing. Out of the 26,000 Muslim warriors who woke up that morning expecting an easy, glorious conquest of Jerusalem, fewer than 2,000 survived to see the sunset. To put that into perspective, that is a staggering 90% casualty rate. It was an absolute annihilation on a scale rarely witnessed in all of medieval military history. The massive, sprawling threat was completely erased in just a matter of hours. Meanwhile, the Crusaders claimed immense fortunes left behind in the mud. They captured Saladin's massive war chest, seizing literal tons of gold, thousands of prized horses, and enough abandoned weapons and armor to equip entire armies. This incredible influx of wealth instantly pulled the completely bankrupt Kingdom of Jerusalem entirely out of debt, fundamentally resurrecting the failing Crusader economy literally overnight.
Section 6. The Legacy of Two Legends.
Per Saladin, this horrific defeat was profoundly humbling and deeply humiliating. In fact, it took him nearly a decade of careful planning and resource gathering to rebuild a military force even comparable to the massive army that was destroyed in those 3 hours at Montgisard. Yet, you have to admit, his resilience was nothing short of legendary. He learned a very hard lesson that day, that raw numbers alone do not guarantee victory, and he approached his enemies thereafter with a newfound, highly cautious respect. For Baldwin, his miraculous triumph proved his sheer tactical genius and his unbreakable iron will. Baldwin's victory at Montgisard successfully bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem an entire decade of survival that they frankly had absolutely no mathematical right to expect. The leper king continued his impossible reign for 8 more agonizing years. By the end of his life, the disease had left him completely blind and entirely paralyzed, yet his brilliant mind and his staggering courage remained entirely unbroken right up until his last breath. When Baldwin finally succumbed to his horrific disease at the tragically young age of 24, a deep, legendary respect had actually been forged between the two opposing monarchs. Reflecting back on his formidable young rival, Saladin himself reportedly said of the king, "I feared that man more than any army."
So it leaves us asking, do great moments make great leaders, or do great leaders make great moments? Baldwin IV achieved something mathematically impossible on that battlefield, proving unequivocally that morale, a solid understanding of strategic geography, and sheer uncompromising courage matter far, far more than the simple numbers written on a page. To summarize this entire study, we saw an unstoppable, massive empire entirely undone by its own hubris and arrogance, and a doomed, fractured kingdom saved by the sheer willpower of a dying teenage boy who simply refused to surrender. Before we wrap up, I definitely want to mention that this study was sourced from some incredibly detailed deep dives by History Marché, Battle Archives, Real Crusades History, and CU in History. A link to the source channels is below in the description box, so definitely go check them out to explore more about this incredible era. And finally, prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated. And give a hype and like, please. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep learning.